Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bowne House Historical Society's series, Eliza Southgate Bowne, in her own words. My name is Emily, and I'm again joined by David. We will be chatting about the letters of Eliza Bowne for all of March in honor of Women's History Month. What are we discussing today, David?
Well, today we are talking about Eliza's experiences during the yellow fever epidemic at the turn of the 19th century. Naturally, we've been curious about how it compares to living during the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'm interested in what we can learn from her letters, and this subject should be especially relatable. When is yellow fever a major issue for Eliza?
Yellow fever reached an epidemic level in New York City in 1803, but it was also quite widespread in 1805. During these times, Eliza mentions the fever in many of her letters, the first of which is in a letter to her mother, while Eliza and Walter Bowne were staying in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Quote, "If the alarm of the fever continues in New York, we shall not return there again, but go into the neighborhood. Send in for a trunk, which I packed for the purpose, in case I feared going in the city, and set off for the Springs or somewhere else. 'Tis very uncertain when we go to housekeeping. The alarm of the fever hurried us out of town without any arrangements towards it, and may, if it continues, keep us out till middle of autumn." End quote. Luckily for Eliza and her husband, their trip coincided with a great uptick of the fever in New York. But as we see, Eliza was well prepared for that possibility, as she packed a trunk before they left the city so that it could be sent to her.
You can sense her rush in those lines, and we can see that there is already one similarity between this outbreak and today, that she avoided the city during the height of the illness.
Many people would have tried to leave the city since it was the epicenter of yellow fever. Several businesses temporarily closed, and anyone who had the means to left New York City during this time. Eliza must have sent for that trunk she packed, because a month later she is now in Ballston Springs, where she notes, quote, "A great many New Yorkers have taken refuge here from the fever," end quote. Ballston Springs would have been a great place to visit while avoiding yellow fever, so it makes sense that New Yorkers would have sought refuge there. At this time, natural springs were becoming very popular tourist destinations, and we may remember that Ballston was where Eliza met Walter just 1 year prior to this letter. Moreover, water from these mineral springs was generally believed to have a great effect on one's health, so naturally anyone fleeing New York would seek out fresh spring water to drink and bathe in during their absence from the city.
So it seems to be the perfect place to relax while staying safe.
It certainly was for Eliza. It would provide these health benefits, but it also would be quite a social affair, since these springs were so fashionable. Eliza always describes the springs with glowing reviews. In particular, she notes, quote, "They dance much as usual. A fine ball tomorrow evening," end quote. Indeed, she mentions dancing in every letter she sends from the springs. In 1803, she spends about 5 weeks between Ballston Springs and another spring in Lebanon, New York.
5 weeks of dancing, fresh water, and pleasant baths doesn't sound too bad to me.
I certainly agree. As a person with relative wealth, Eliza was able to escape the worst of the epidemic, but she notes a few ways that it negatively affected her. Quote, "When we left New York, Mr. Bowne sent it, a package of letters, to a commission merchant who does business with several Portland people, and requested him to send it by the first vessel. As you haven't received it, I suppose the fever which broke out immediately after induced him to shut up his store, or perhaps prevented any Portland vessel from coming near the city," end quote. The delay or total avoidance of shipments to or from the port of New York affected more than post. When yellow fever returns in 1805, Eliza writes to her sister asking for help. Quote, "Do ask Papa if he could send us 6 or 8 barrels of potatoes. There's like to be a great scarcity in New York. Put them in the hold of the vessel or anywhere," end quote.
This account sounds more familiar. Supply shortages and delayed mail, even if the reasons were different, the experience is similar. We can relate.
Yes, in 1805, Eliza and Walter again retreated from the city, but not to the spring this time. Instead, they went out to Jamaica, Queens, and even though they were removed from the city, they still took familiar precautions since Eliza was in the very early stages of pregnancy. Quote, "Shopping at present is a prohibited pleasure to me. I can have anything sent to me to look at, and therefore 'tis quite as well as if I went for them. I don't mean, you shall understand, because I don't go shopping, that I am confined to the house. On the contrary, I am much better than could be expected, and hope, with care, to do very well. I shall go out very little until the middle or last of the winter, when I hope, if I continue well, to be as smart as other people. My husband does not allow me to go into a shop. I laugh at him and tell him I don't believe but the health of his purse is one half his concern. A fine excuse. End quote.
At least she can still have some humor about the situation.
Once again, her letters highlight her humanity and her personality.
Thank you again for joining me. David and I are happy to announce that the Bowne House has decided to continue with our short chats. During our next talk, we will be focusing on Eliza Bowne's husband, Walter Bowne. Visit our website, bownehouse.org, to stay up to date on all our latest videos. I hope you all will join us again in 2 weeks.
Goodbye, everyone.